Nature of Society, Part 3, Session 9R. Labor is likened to a man who, on carrying home his earnings, is fully depleted of it by robbers on the way. The biggest robber is the landlord. Improvements, no matter how big, reforms, no matter how far-reaching and beneficial, will not change the impact of the landlord's demand once it is in place. As Henry George said, I have likened labor to a man beset by a series of robbers, because there are in every country other things than private property in land, which tend to diminish the national prosperity and divert the wealth earned by labor into the hands of non-producers. This is the tendency of monopoly of the processes and machinery of production and exchange, the tendency of protective tariffs, of bad systems of currency and finance, of corrupt government, of public debts, of standing armies, and of wars and preparations for wars. But these things, some of which are conspicuous in one country and some in another, cannot account for the impoverishment of labor, which is to be seen everywhere. They are the lesser robbers, and to drive them off is only to leave more for the great robber to take, taken by protection or free trade. As this main cause of labor impoverishment remains in place, no reform can have a permanent effect. Public debt might be abolished, armies disbanded, protection tariffs lifted, governments administered with the greatest honesty, economy, and efficiency, monopolies, save the monopoly in land, destroyed, all these without an iota of improvement in the condition of the working man. The effect of these reforms will only improve the production of wealth in the community, but as long as there is a competition for employment of workmen who are powerless to employ themselves, wages will be steady, proportionately and absolutely, forced to a minimum that men will accept for a bare living. This will continue as long as land is enclosed or private property in land exists. There is much emphasis placed on education that can be the panacea for the plight of the working class. This is an improvement without argument that can benefit the individual, and usually gives him an advantage over others who are not educated. But these uneducated workers' wages form the regulative basis of all other wages. Wages of the educated class will only command those for a special skill, but the mere possession of this special skill cannot prevent wages from being forced down to the lowest level. So, the one great reform that will make the permanent difference is the reform in land tenure. When the population is sparse and unoccupied land is plenty, labor can thrive, albeit in circumstances which may be primitive. As populations increase and lands are enclosed, the competition of non-landowners intensifies, and the landowner demands and receives a disproportionately larger share of the yield on the site. The primary factors of production are land and labor. Capital is a product of the two, and the capitalist is the intermediary between the landlord and the laborer. Labor who feels employers are the oppressors is misled. The perceived oppression of capital on labor is really the result of the helplessness to which labor is reduced as a result of land enclosure. Capital does not have the power to reduce to near starvation levels wages. Whatever capitalistic monopolies can extract from labor, these are much less than what monopolistic landowners can and do extract. As Henry George says, No matter whether the social organization be simple or complex, no matter whether the intermediaries between the owners of land and the owners of the mere power to labor be few or many, wherever the available land has been fully appropriated as the property of some of the people, there must exist a class, the laborers of ordinary ability and skill, who can never hope to get more than a bare living for the hardest toil, and who are constantly in danger of failure to get even that. It's taken from Protection of Free Trade. So far, we have suggested that the abolition of protection, although it would increase production of wealth, will not accomplish the permanent uplift of the working class as long as the land on which we all live and produce on is made the property of some. In this scenario, increase in productive power due to improvements will only increase the wealth of those who own the land and impoverish those who don't. For there to be the permanent uplift of the working class, we must abolish the inequality of legal rights to land and restore to all the natural and equal rights in the common heritage. How can this be done? Let us be clear. To secure to each of the people of any country his equal right to the land of that country does not mean to secure to each an equal piece of land. This, apart from missing the principle, is extremely impractical and would not solve the problem. As Henry George says, where population is increasing and its centers are constantly changing, where different vocations make different uses of land and require different qualities and amounts of it, where improvements and discoveries and inventions are constantly bringing out new uses and changing relative values, a division that should be equal today would soon become unequal. And to maintain equality, a redivision every year would be necessary. Protection of free trade. To have the annual redivision or to treat land as common would only be practical where men lived in movable tents and made no permanent improvements. No one would engage in agriculture or build houses or do anything of the sort of a permanent nature. Because of this, it is very necessary to the permanent use and improvement of land that society should secure to the user and improve security of tenure, so that equal rights to land does not imply equal division of land. There are two principles upon which a correct system of land tenure should be based. 1. All men have equal rights to the use and enjoyment of the elements provided by nature. And 2. Each man has an exclusive right to the use and enjoyment of what is produced by his own labor. With regard to the first principle, if this principle was wrong, then men could claim any other element other than earth as his own. For example, the sun, water, air, and charge other men for the use of these, and it would be okay. And with regard to the second principle, if everyone is secured the full right of property in the produce of his labor, then no one can have any right of property in what it is and in what is not the produce of labor. Certainly, personal income tax does not subscribe to this second principle. These two principles are not difficult to subscribe to, no matter how complex or highly developed industry and/or the country is. Land will now have to be treated as joint property owned by all citizens, as would the case be for a railroad or ship having several shareholders. Persons having use of any piece of land would have to pay to the community an amount commensurate with its site value. Persons wanting to use land would otherwise pay to the community similar amounts commensurate with the land values. These land or site values would be net of the value of any improvement made to them or a profit on the labor and capital used on them. With this policy in place, all would be placed with an equality for the use and enjoyment of natural resources provided by Providence. But many contend that this policy would be ideal if a country was being newly formed, and it would be very difficult to implement in a country that is already developed and settled. But the implementation would be entirely feasible using a gradual process, but simultaneously removing those taxes that are placed on labor, capital, goods, services, and trade, while increasing dues on land values to as near as possible to the full annual value of these sites. This could be rolled out over several years. In future sessions, we will show how this is to be done practically. When the regime is fully established, the selling price of land will entirely disappear. All taxes that now fall upon capital will be abolished. There will now be no taxes of houses or improvements, no taxes on mining or farming or imports. Everyone will be free to make or save wealth, to buy, sell, or exchange without intervention of the taxman. Those taxes which now increase prices will now disappear. A large and increasing fund will now be provided for common uses, especially in those areas of the economy that do not now receive adequate funding. Land will now be thrown open and kept open for capital and labor to combine, and it will be very unprofitable to hold it out of use for speculative purposes. The speculative value of land will be destroyed whether land was used or not. This former speculative value and what it will be reduced to will now go to the community who in the first place created it. We conclude by what Henry George has said on this. Thus, the great cause of the present unequal distribution of wealth would be destroyed, and that one-sided competition would cease, which now deprives men who possess nothing but power to labor of the benefits of advancing civilization, and forces wages to a minimum, no matter what the increase of wealth. Labor, free to the natural elements of production, would no longer be incapable of employing itself, and competition, acting as fully and freely between employers as between employed, would carry wages up to what is truly their natural rate, the full value of the produce, and keep them there. Protection or free trade. Free trade in its essence requires the abolition of protection, but all tariffs, except those imposed for public health or morals, on imports and exports. True free trade does not stop with these. The internal taxes that fall on buying, selling, transporting or exchanging, transacting, the adoption of true free trade involves not only the abolition of indirect taxation, but also direct taxation on labor, the produce of labor, capital, and wealth. Everyone is now free to make, exchange, give, spend, and bequeath all things save and except those things that it negatively affect for public safety, health, and morals. Taxation on the value of land, which is proposed to replace all current direct and indirect taxation, must not be confused with taxes on land. Taxes on land are taxes levied by quantity or area and are equal in all land and hence ultimately fall on production. They only apply when production takes place. Taxes on land values do not fall on all land, but on valuable land only in proportion to its value. A tax on land values is of all taxes that which best fulfills every requirement of a perfect tax. As land is in full view of everyone, there is more certainty in collection, greater ease of collection, less expense, and not in any way inhibit production or incentive. It is in fact a rent, a taken for the use of the community of a value that arises not from individual exertion, but from the growth of the community. As Henry George said, taxes on land values are thus the only taxes from which, in accordance with the principle of free trade, any considerable amount of revenue can be raised, and it is evident that to carry out the free trade principle to the point of abolishing all taxes that hamper or lessen production would of itself involve very nearly the same measures which we have seen are required to assert the common right to land and place all citizens upon equal footing. Free trade means free production. Now fully to free production, it is necessary not only to remove all taxes on production, but also to remove all other restrictions on production. True free trade, in short, requires that the active factor of production, labor, shall have free access to the passive factor, land. To secure this, all monopoly of land must be broken up, and the equal right of all to the use of the natural elements must be secured by the treatment of the land as the common property in use of right of the whole people. Protection of free trade. Next week we will continue our discussion on trade. Before we end, I would like again to let you attendees know that Unsustainable Development is an educational offering devoted to the dissemination of its course to all of mankind and to those who have the English language as their official language in the first instance, and to all eventually all over the world. To make this possible, and because we do not charge a fee for this dissemination, we rely wholeheartedly on monetary donations to meet the cost of achieving these goals. If you have found these sessions useful thus far and would like others to have access to them, we would greatly accept your donations should you be inclined to offer them. You can send donations to our PayPal account at the email address nigellitens@gmail.com. Thank you for your kind gesture.